Good morning, everyone. My name is Harjaap Singh, and today I would be doing an informative speech on the impact of protests in 2020. The purpose of the speech is to inform the listening audience about the positives and negatives of protests occurring nationwide and why they are happening. Everyone is well aware of the wrongdoings committed by some police officers in the United States in which their actions have sparked outrage for individuals across the nation. The officers who killed the unarmed and innocent young black lives did not receive the punishment they deserved to get. They were simply released without any charges, and it is not fair because if a common person such as me murdered someone, then they would have to face the consequences. Yet if an officer murders an unarmed calm person, then they don't have to pay for their mistake. The unjust, unfair treatment and unnecessary killings of minorities has led the path for protests to occur. Are protests reshaping the world for better? Do the negative effects of protests outweigh the positive effects? And these are just some of the questions that will be thoroughly answered by the end of the speech. To start off the speech, the first topic will cover one key innocent shooting of a young black woman named Breonna Taylor. Then the second main point will talk about the positives that come out of protesting, and lastly, the informative speech will end with the negatives that are associated with those positives. First and most importantly, I'd like to mention some of the well-known killings that have happened by law enforcement officials. One key shooting that happened without a bad reason was the shooting of Breonna Taylor. An article from Fox LA states that 3 officers fired into her apartment on March 13 during a no-knock search warrant targeting her ex-boyfriend who no longer lived there. Without proper reasoning, officers fired shots rather than knocking on the door to talk like real officers would. Regardless, officers should wake up every morning expecting the unexpected. Warrants can go on for years, and the life of an individual can change within those years, in which this was the same case for Breonna Taylor since her ex-boyfriend had moved out. On top of the innocent killing, the same article says the grand jury's decision, which in essence absolved 2 of the officers of wrongdoing and indicted the 3rd for wanton endangerment because his bullets went into a nearby apartment. The court basically decided to let the officers free even though Taylor was killed because of their suspicion. How can they just kill someone and get away with it? The grand jury added that wanton endangerment seemed to be a factor involved as well, since bullets also went into a local resident's apartment, but nonetheless no one else around got injured. Furthermore, unnecessary killings committed by police officers has led for protests to erupt across the globe. Deaths of individuals such as Breonna Taylor have sparked the protests, in which most of them are positive due to the changes they are making. The article named "Do Protests Even Work?" states that protests work because they direct attention towards an injustice and can change people's minds, a slow but profoundly powerful process. Protests work because protesters can demonstrate the importance of a belief to society at large and let authorities understand that their actions will be opposed, especially if those protesters are willing to take serious risks for their cause. The fact that protests are powerful tells us that they bring change to society and its people, whether it may be sudden or change that occurs after a long period of time. When another non-guilty black man was killed by an officer who was putting the weight of his body via his knee, as everyone knows, the George Floyd case, the officers were not charged, but once protests demanded for the officer to pay for his doing, him and his fellow officers that were involved in the case were charged for the killing. Previous article from The Atlantic also adds that protests work because they change the protesters themselves, turning some from casual participants into lifelong activists, which in turn changes society. New races such as white or Indian also join the movement since their perspectives on things change when they witness something unjust, which in return creates a united movement and takes away the factor of racism. If more people join in, united, then they, the people, have power to demand for what is right and change society positively. Therefore, it is factual that protests are the only way for people to achieve the goal they want. Without the right to protest, there would be no other way for people to demand what they want, and noticeably, the government would be the one with the power when the people should have power as well. The people are the ones that elect the government officials. Oppositely, there is usually some sort of bad in the good of things. While there are many positives that are achieved through these protests, there are also some negatives attached. A New York Times article named "Please, I Don't Have Insurance. Business Plead with Protesters" tells us that businesses across the country suffered destruction over the weekend as protesters unleashed their anger over the death of George Floyd on commercial enterprises from the offices of major multinational corporations and banks to family-owned restaurants and businesses. As the good people protest for the correct cause, on the opposite side, the violent individuals are damaging buildings, which really impacts some small business owners since life savings are spent towards those businesses in order for them to flourish. Businesses have nothing to do with the way law enforcement acts, therefore why should they get property damaged? A peaceful protest can achieve the end goal as well, therefore protesters should not damage buildings as it is expensive for owners to rebuild. With properties getting destroyed, the New York Times also states masked young people of all races swarmed through the smashed front windows and left with pieces of clothing and accessories worth of hundreds of dollars each, in which this shows that theft was the case on top of destruction. Merchandise is typically ordered and a store has to pay a special price in order to stock the items. Sadly, in this case, the money used to stock the merchandise went down the drain for the business owner since protesters stole the items from the store. Both the bill of the destruction and stolen items needs to be paid mandatorily by an owner as well, especially if it is a small business, and in worst cases, the business might have to shut down if the bill is not affordable, which gives the upper hand of profiting to the bigger businesses. Overall, towards the end of the speech, the audience should be able to understand why the protests happened through a couple of fine examples, see the positives in it, and then the negatives of protest to solely determine whether the positives outweigh the negatives or vice versa. As the audience knows now, the impact of protests have been tremendous if thought as positive or negative. The reason as to why protests are happening in the first place is because people want to fight against the wrongdoings committed by some of the police officers here in the United States. The fight is leaning towards change and reform, which is, in a sense, are positive factors. But as we see, often some people tend to go in the wrong direction in the fight. Looting and destruction seem to be the negative factors that are attached to the positives in protesting, although the negatives and positives tie up into each other, creating the same end goal of unity, change, and or reform on a decision. Even though the negatives change the way of obtaining the end goal, they still do not impact the goal itself, but merely instead they help make the goal easier to reach. Therefore, it is clear that negative factors do not cross the positive factors in protesting. Protests are happening across the world because individuals want to fight for what is right, in which this leads the impact to be enormous on society and its people. An article from the New York Times, Los Angeles Fox News Channel, and a website called Atlantic has been used.